please let us know who's here and how do you relax? Okay, so I would like to introduce Michael Small, who shared the story with us and then get us thinking about how we really move from uh, service client to valued citizen. So, Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. And I want to share a story from my past. Decades ago, I was running a psychiatric day treatment center for people with intellectual disabilities, and we got a referral, a woman named Susan. And they said, we don't know what to do because Susan keeps getting into fights. And she was at that point in high school. And when we looked at it further, they said, well, you know, how teenagers get in each other's face, and usually they back down, you can de-escalate. So with Susan, you can't de-escalate. She will not back down. If the other person doesn't back down, it turns into a fight. So we took her, and what we had initially heard should have been a clue, but this was decades ago. And so we just said, let's see what we can do with therapy. Let's see what we can do with helping her have a healthier environment. And we had no fight. She adjusted well, had a lot of teenage angst, but not really big problems. Then her dad, who was in the military, was reassigned, and she went with him, and I lost track of her. And more than a decade later, I was at the University of Maryland Medical School, and I was in charge of an inpatient behavioral unit, which was a bad idea, but at the time seemed good. And I got a call from the state director of ED services. And she said, you need to go to the state penitentiary, pick up Susan. And sure enough, it turned out to be the same Susan. And I was going, how did she get into the penitentiary? But it turned out Dad had retired and they moved back to the local area. And Dad and Susan would get into arguments, and the arguments would escalate because Susan wouldn't back down. Dad didn't feel like he should have to back down. And the police would be called. And typically, the police would de-escalate. But one time the police came, instead of de-escalating, the policeman who was feeling his power escalated it. It wound up being physical. Susan wound up being cuffed, taken to the local hospital for psych eval. The physician there said, I'm not sure. I'm going to send you to the state hospital for an evaluation. When Susan got in the state hospital, the nurse that introduced her to the ward that bore a remarkable resemblance to the nurse in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Nurse Ratched. And the nurse got into Susan's face and said, we have rules here and you will follow them. And Susan said, oh yeah. And the nurse said, oh yeah. And it escalated, and there was another physical confrontation. Well, the nurse preferred charges, and Susan wound up in the county jail. But again, you had the matron in the jail who escalated the situation. And Susan again didn't back down, and she wound up in the women's penitentiary. Well, the people who ran the women's penitentiary said, Susan doesn't back down, and even who else is here, Susan's going to get killed. Because there are people who, when you don't provide them with respect, will find a way to get back at you physically. So they had Susan living in the infirmary and complained to the warden that Susan didn't belong here and she was going to be killed. And the person in charge of the women's pen talked to the secretary of the Department of Corrections, who talked to the secretary for Health and Mental Hygiene, who talked to the state director, who gave me the instruction to go get her. So I brought her back to our inpatient behavioral unit, and we had no problem because nobody got in anybody's face. That was a pretty clear instruction. And Susan had some social issues. She didn't pick up on social cues. So when you were done talking with her, you had to gently tell her that you had other things to do. Otherwise, you start escalating. And I was going, we're going to plan for Susan to leave. And the regional director for the state got wind of this, called me and said, Michael, you've gone too far this time. She's too dangerous to live in the community. And I said, well, she's going to move. And she did. She moved to a downtown apartment. And we were concerned about her safety. But she settled right in. And what she loved to do was take care of other people. So she would carry the groceries for the aging people. And it's a city, so people typically would put their groceries in a little wheel cart and take it back to their apartment. There's no driving and parking. And Susan would be the person who would be there saying, let me help you. Let me carry it up the stairs. And Susan became connected to her community. And a year after she moved in, she was nominated for Volunteer of the Year and got it. The governor of Maryland handed a plaque to Susan. And the plaques, of course, were handed to the governor. And I took some satisfaction with the fact that the woman who was giving the plaque to the governor was the very woman who said she's too dangerous to live in the community. And Susan has now lived in the community for over a decade, and she lives successfully with a few simple rules. So first, we need to keep in mind that it's really important to Susan to feel respected, to have control, and to be helpful. She will not go to a traditional day service. She will not participate in traditional services at all, but she will be very successful if she has control and has opportunities to be helpful. We also want to remember that she can physically hurt other people. And so she needs to be in settings where she's not going to be confronted with that. And what we realize now, what we didn't realize then, is this was a trauma trigger. It was pretty simple to avoid. And Susan recognized people who don't have any control and doesn't get trapped by them. But if the people who are paid always ask and never order things go well. The only tricky bit is making sure you have a good relationship with the neighbors. Because Susan will talk to somebody who's homeless and invite them to stay in her apartment and then become distressed that they're taking up their space, spending her money, and they need help. Susan needs help to get them out. And Susan cannot pass up a stray cat. We need to run a cat outplacement service so her apartment is not overrun by cats. Just check with her every now and then. Make sure the neighbors get connected when they do. And with those things in place, with Susan feeling safe, Susan having control, Susan having relationships with mostly people significantly older than her, she has been successful. And she went from somebody where they were projecting that she would need 2-on-1 supervision to somebody who gives drop-in support, very little paid support, very little connection with the system. And I think that illustrates one strand of the work that we're trying to do.
And Michael, I know that you said this is from someone that you worked with decades ago, but one of the new realizations is this whole concept of trauma-informed discovery to really provide support to folks. So we're thinking that as we, particularly with folks who may have these labels of behavioral challenges, that perhaps it is related to trauma. And so the first question that we'd like you to think about as we're supporting people to move from this service client to valued citizen role is, how do you account for trauma when you are supporting people? And how does that impact the supports we provide to someone? And we're going to give you about 15 minutes in your breakout room to have that conversation. I'll just type it in chat so you've got that available to you. People who are not familiar with the World Cafe, let me just kind of give you a quick rundown of what we are looking at. It's really an opportunity to bring people together to think about the big question about what are we doing to support people to move from service client to valued citizen, and really thinking about how we can have some conversations in this aspect, thinking about the trauma focus to really share about what are our thoughts on this? How do we really pass this knowledge on to others and build upon the conversations that we are having? So we really want to use conversation in order to do that. And the World Cafe Guidelines kind of talks about how we have meaningful conversations, how no idea is a bad idea. We really want to share our thoughts, collect our thoughts, and we'll post those on board number 6 so that we can then build upon that when we go into our next conversation. Welcome back, everybody.
We just talked a lot about a couple different some people we know, and we found some keys were like finding gifts, finding those healthy and healing relationships, and finding their definition of safe, and finding purpose and meaning.
Great. Thank you, Carla.
Room 2.
We talked about, have people that we support, a lot of people we support have a very limited history. When they come into the agency to be supported, they have a very limited history available. I know somebody that I supported in the past was someone that was nonverbal, and they did art therapy, which was very helpful, kind of helping them through some of their trauma from the past. And then I think failing, we were talking about fear of failing someone that we support. Andrea spoke to someone that had come into the agency that they were unable to support because of the complex needs. And I think as supporters, that's the last thing we want, is to fail the people we support. We want them to be successful in their community and their life.
Room 3 is Lori. I can throw a couple things out, and maybe you guys can fill in the blanks. I think one, to reiterate, a lot of times folks have limited or erroneous kind of historical records, and also the idea of almost a presumption of trauma, given the statistics and the prevalence of trauma we know that are in people's lives, much less people and much higher with people with disabilities. I think there was we had a conversation almost of kind of like approaching with a humility in terms of walking into relationships and understanding that there's so much we don't know and we may never know with people coming to us. And also one interesting conversation was about how the history of the places where people are, which may be the same organizations or the same places and the same people, even where the trauma may have occurred many years before. So having that kind of sensitivity and understanding. And also there's talk about kind of how we think about where there's biographical timelines, where we've sort of looked at people's history, but making sure that we're kind of really connecting that to the present and where people are now, and really having it driven with an eye toward what it means for the future. Maybe Stefan, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit, but those are the main things. Lori, did I miss anything?
I think that was a pretty good catch. One thing that Stefan came up with, which I don't know if it was his idea or if it was sort of a melding, but he was talking about mapping and mapping like we might do relationships or people or whatever, and doing like those maps for someone's past, present, and future. For someone who can't do a timeline of this happened before that, or this happened on Tuesday the 27th, just doing tell us about your past, and we can capture graphically concepts and feelings and things that might give us some clues even if we don't have facts and history. And I'm going to try that.
I think an important idea is to mixed methods of exploring with the people what is important in the past, and maybe what resources we can find in the past, or rediscover things, and that people have a vivid documentation of things on pictures and things that were important for them in the past, combining it with what is important now for me in the present, like the person-centered thinking tools, and seeing, okay, what ideas will give this to me for my future life. Do I get new and good ideas? And I see it something like a lying eight, that past, present, and future is somehow interconnected,
and it is important to play in all these 3 time zones to create a valued life. And that means people should also have for them a valued past and a valued present. So it is important for the identity work, who I am and who I want to be, to map out these different time zones.
All right. Thank you, Stefan. And room 4, Bob, I think you were in there with Jen and Holly.
Okay, so I think we talked a little bit about, in Michael's story, the concept that there was very little connection to the system as the person's life sort of improved, and that this idea Bob had brought up that perfectionism is a myth, that doesn't really exist, and also this idea of the balance of important 2 and important 4, that it's not really based on a person's medical diagnoses, but it's really based on what that balance is to make a person's, to give them a shot at a good life, right? At that idea of balancing out those two areas, so that you're not all healthy and safe, and you're not all sort of at risk, right? There's that balance, and the idea of like going to the system last, right? So you set up important 2 and important 4, and look at the circle of support and the supporters and the things that are around the person, and then when and if only then you need something, then you go to the system and purchase what you need to supplement for that person.
All right. Okay, to go to room 5. Steve, Tammy, Demir.
Hello. It sounds like a lot of you had the exact same kind of ideas and thoughts that we did. Of course, we heard this before, that the first thing we do is assume trauma, and then really get to know who that person is really, because we all acknowledge that labels and putting people in boxes when they are not living in a community life is going to look a lot different when they are. Establishing relationship expectations, letting that person identify what those things are, if at all possible, so that we can empower the person in their environment so that they become happier and healthier as well, by providing that safe and supportive and healing environment for them, because then you start seeing a much happier person. Another thing that I haven't heard yet, that everyone felt was really important, is medication schedules. Realizing that people can be overprescribed medications, and that some of the part of the trauma is being masked through medication over prescription. So just really evaluating that medication schedule to make it's a must, to make sure that the person can actually function in their community, so that they can find that belonging. And like Lori said earlier, just being able to let that person express real emotion, and then identify why that emotion is occurring and it's why it's being expressed, so that they can find the proper support and not medicating to mask that true emotion, so that person feels in that safe and healing environment.
Great, thank you, Tammy. A lot of good thought, a lot of good information, and really is a nice lead into our next conversation for our breakout rooms, which is really focusing on what's really needed to support inclusion and citizenship for people. Thinking about skills that you can use to make that happen, other tidbits that you may have encountered that makes it really successful. So again, we'll spend 15 minutes in our breakout.
All right. Maybe we can go from 5 to 1 this time. And in room 5, I know, I think it was Stefan, Bob, and Michael.
So the big thing we talked about was connections, and we've kind of lost the art of how to make connections. And what do we do to help those folks who may be in those positions really be bridges to connecting people, as opposed to being doors where they have people walk through and then that's it. So really thinking about who's got that gift of making a connection happen, and how can we teach people that. Sometimes it can be a very simple thing, but I think that really was the essence of what we talked about. Michael, anything that really stood out for you otherwise?
Bob, can you repeat the question for everybody? Just, I know we didn't, it wasn't posted, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page.
So the question was, what do we need to do to really support full inclusion and citizenship?
In order to begin that connection with the introduction, we need to know what people's gifts are. And we need to recognize that people connect based on what they get from the other person. So it's contribution. In order to know that, we need to spend some time with the person and learn what other people perceive as their gifts. And then connection with really require shared value goals and shared value time in that instant. I think that's some of what else we brought up.
Right. I think we took a different tack, so I'm gonna jump over 4 and come back to us. We go to room 3 with Carla, Lori, and Vanessa.
We talked really about meeting people where they are, not having prerequisites for building connections. Like, you don't have to, too many goals get set up around learning to tie your shoes instead of getting out to where you belong, but meeting people where they are, finding places in community and knowing what those community assets are, and really finding ways for people to identify and understand their gifts and places where they can give those gifts, where those gifts will be received. Find the places in the community where people are ready for the gifts that the person has that you find. I think that kind of sums it up.
All right. And room 2, Tammy, Steve, and Jen.
Okay, so our group, one of the things that we emphasized is that the realization is not, things are not going to happen overnight, so it takes time. So be patient. We talked about gifts that you could contribute. We also talked about, we all have these toolboxes with maps and paths, charting life course, essential lifestyle planning. To use the different tools within your box, and don't use them like a checklist. In other words, I check that off and let's move on to the next. We talked about gifts as being parts of the gifts of the hand, heart, and head as a means of developing gifts. I spoke a bit about asset-based community development, where you can go out into the community, do some asset maps, and look at what's available for the person within their immediate community. And we talked about when you're developing the match, to make sure that the match for the community and providing their gifts is based on the person's passion. It's not staff influenced, it's their passion. And so you've got to find that passion for the gifts so that they can contribute and feel connected to their community.
All right. Thank you, Steve. And we have Amy, Andrea, and Tanya. I think we're assigned to room 1.
My mind was going a little bit more to, education, reducing stigma, institutionalization, how that, the generation right now is still moving very slowly to shift in the new direction of inclusion. Yes, we're trying to expedite it, but it's still a very slow moving process. So resources and education of, parents and just the availability of those resources and how do we access them to provide support for our individuals to integrate.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. So room 4 was, I think but Demir and myself, and I think what we were talking about was kind of, in terms of the question, what do you need to do to support full inclusion and citizenship? We kind of were talking through the lens of, still, related to trauma and trauma-informed supports, and the idea that, training really is still not broadly available to on multiple levels so whether you're talking trauma-informed support or person-centered support, it's the same idea that staff aren't getting the broad training and support to be able to support the people that they're working with. But the other thing is sort of organizational culture, in terms of organizations reinforcing, a culture and values that really may not be one, trauma informed, because staff having to work through their own trauma and manage their own trauma, and then being expected to kind of support people in that same way, having cultures that aren't necessarily person-centered or trauma-informed. So, and that was at multiple levels, and also in terms of how we plan. So how we, whether we're planning in a person-centered or trauma-informed way, genuinely. Demir, you got anything you want to add to that?
Unfortunately, I don't pass what others have also added.
Yep. Okay. That's pretty much it.
That wraps us up. Now that fall is upon us, what are you looking forward to in the fall? Please post your closing thought on, and we hope to see you next week for our next Wicked Wednesday. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Michael. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.